Yes, BookTube. It's time for another used book haul. Can't seem to stop buying books, so I'll present them. They're divided in half. We got a stack of nonfiction, and we got a stack of mostly fiction, so classics and fiction. I got a lot more fiction this time than I usually do, but there'll be a reason for that, as I'll explain. Hopefully I can get it all into one video. And there are some recurring themes in this book haul. This one and the first book will show you the theme that I can't get rid of over across all of my book hauls, and that's translations. I always grab classics or translations of classics that I already own, and the first book is Aristotle's The Nicomachean Ethics. This is the Oxford translation, and I have the old Penguin translation, and I also have the Hackett translation. So I have 2 copies of this already, but having another translation is always good to have another one in the bag. I like to compare the translations too, especially for someone who's considered as difficult as Aristotle. I looked into this translation and at least the notes on the translation, and this is not actually a new translation. This is a translation from the 20s that's been revised 3 times. It was revised. When were the first 2 times it was revised? I don't think it actually says. All I know is that this third revision with the notes and introduction was done in 2009, but there was 2 other people who revised this 1920s translation, and then Leslie Brown is the editor of this volume. So that's Aristotle. I do have a few more works in translation, I think. Maybe just 2 more. And then next we go to a political book. This is Life and Times of Liberal Democracy by C.B. McPherson. This book is tiny. It's actually just over 100 pages, so 120 pages. And this author sort of interests me. He's got a work that I really would like to have, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, Hobbes to Locke. So that's a book of his I would like to read, but I've been picking up some of his other works that I find used. I found a collection of his essays. What was it called? Democratic Theory, I believe. I believe that was the one. I'm looking on the back here of the list of books that he's written. Democratic Theory, which is a collection of essays of his. But then this one here is his look at liberal democracy. What was it? Professor McPherson rejects the claims commonly made for the 17th century Puritans and Jefferson and Rousseau as liberal Democrats, and argues that liberal democratic theory begins with Bentham and James Mill. So I find that's an interesting take. And for a book that calls itself A Life of Times, it's tiny. So I wonder what the reason for that is. Let's see here. Next is a classic in history of science or philosophy of science or whatever. It's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And this is the 2nd edition, and it says it's enlarged. So I guess he added more material. I actually believe I have this as an ebook, but picking up an old print copy is I won't turn that down especially for books like this. Like for example, I have this on my Western Canon reading list. It's an influential book in the 20th century, so I have that down. But I actually sampled all of these books, and this was one of the ones that disappointed me the most. I don't know how much I'm going to get along with Thomas Kuhn's writing style, but we'll see. This one is I should explain this one a little bit. This one is influential in the sense that it tracks in history how scientific revolutions happen, and I believe he argues that, or he makes the case that it doesn't happen in overarching like sparks of genius, but that it's how does he? I don't know. that I think it's more like small progress, or maybe it's the small progress of trial and error that he rejects, and it's over. I don't know. You can tell I haven't read these books. I'm just thinking along about what they are, based off of my limited exposure to them. So, the next one is The Sacred and the Profane, The Nature of Religion. This is by Marcia Eliade, and this author really, really interests me as a thinker on religion. He's got a 3-volume work called The History of Religious Ideas. I have the first and third volumes as an ebook. The second volume is the volume that touches on Christianity, so it's a lot more difficult to get. But this is a single standard volume work, which is just the subtitle here says the groundbreaking work by one of the greatest authorities on myth, symbol, and ritual. So it's his look at what religion really is, what it consists of, and why it matters. So famed historian of religion, he observes that even moderns who proclaim themselves residents of a completely profane world are still unconsciously nourished by the memory of the sacred. And maybe that sets your hackles up and you have no intention of agreeing to that or not. I tend to side with him, even though I don't consider myself religious. I do think there is this whole idea of there's a whole side of the humans that religion touches on, that this whole emphasis of scientific rationality does not satisfy or does not help explain. So there's a whole lot of motivations and whatnot, and I'm very careful with how which ideas go about professing that, because you have like famous ones like Jung, and you have like the mythology, like was it Joseph Campbell or someone Campbell, and there's more in that tradition as well, but I'm not totally sure if I'm willing to just buy their ideas wholesale. But I think there's something to that argument, and that it can, even if it can't be, say, scientifically demonstrated to perfection, which is kind of the point. Like, you can't always scientifically demonstrate everything about humans and our motivations and what matters to us. So I think there's something compelling in that, and this author is in that tradition. Next is a work of philosophy. So it's The Hobbit and Philosophy. This is for when you've lost your dwarves, your wizard, and your way, and it's edited by Gregory Basham and Eric Bronson. This was a bit of an interesting book because, for one, I really do like The Hobbit, so I'm not going to this more really for the philosophy, but more for the thinking of The Hobbit. Like, I want this book to be an interesting work on reflections on The Hobbit, and maybe if they're more philosophical, maybe that will add something, maybe that'll detract from something. I don't know. I think there's more in this series. There's Lord of the Rings and philosophy, there's Chronicles of Narnia and philosophy, there's basketball and philosophy, poker and philosophy, baseball and philosophy, Batman and philosophy. My goodness, there's a whole series of these things. So we'll see how that is. This next volume is a very strange volume. It's probably the weirdest volume that I've picked up, or it's 2 volumes actually. And I found the very first volume, held it in my hand, and I was like, well, I'll grab this. It's volume 1. I had no hope of picking volume 2 or finding volume 2, but sure enough, I found volume 2 in a very random spot in the same store. So then I picked up volume 2, and they were dirt cheap, so it wasn't like I was paying a whole lot for them. But I really don't know what to make of them, so I'll show. So it's Endgame by Derek Jensen, and this is volume 1, The Problem of Civilization, and then we have volume 2, Resistance. And so I'm not totally familiar with this thinker, other than I've watched some of his videos online, and there's one in particular that I found quite funny, because it's true, and if you look it up, it's called, was it Queer Theory Jeopardy, in which he talks about like quotes from Foucault and some other influential thinkers, much to the dismay of half his class, who like to throw insults at him. But yeah, this is his 2-volume work on his attitudes towards climate change. Because from what I've understood from him, is that he's a climate activist and scholar, and this is his comprehensive look at the issue of climate change, and this was published in 2006, I believe. So he was alarmist by then already in 2006, and I sampled this. I gave this a sample, and I don't know if I'm gonna like how this is presented, because I'm open to his ideas, of course, because he sounds like a good thinker, but the book seems very fragmented, and it's told not as like a scholarly argument, which is fine, but it's told as in a collection of stories, if that makes sense. And I don't know how well these stories are going to stitch together, if there's like a comprehensive theme. So, and the premise, what I've gotten from this, is that civilization is just going to continue to destroy the environment, so the only way to counter that is through pointed resistance, which can lead to violence, because there's one story that I sampled in here where he says, he asks people, do they think that society is just going, or civilization is just going to naturally stop polluting the environment, or to stop destroying the environment with no incentive? And of course everyone says no. So he says, well, if you look in the past, how have people made change that will, emergency change that our human planet and human future depends on? Well, he says, if we have to, we might have to resort to violence. But I don't know if that's what his solution is. That might be something, that might be just him thinking out loud, contemplating it as an idea, and then seeing where that goes, because it's not just climate change that he's concerned about. It's the destruction of the natural environment, and the destruction of indigenous ideas or indigenous cultures. And he says, when he brings up the idea of violence to people who've been directly in line with the fallout of, say, destruction of environments or destruction of indigenous localities, they're usually a lot more receptive to the idea than people in the West, and obviously so. So if he advocates for violence in there, I'm not sure how well I'm going to get along with that, but we'll see. He'll make his argument, or make his case. The next book is a political book. It's Our Political Nature. It's by Avi Tuskman, and the subtitle is The Evolutionary Origins of What Divides Us. And I've never actually heard of this book before, but if I had, I know I would have put it on my wish list on Amazon, or whatever app, Goodreads. Usually it's Amazon these days, ever since Book Depository died a few years ago. But I've never heard of this book, but the premise is very interesting, though I don't know how much I'm going to actually buy it. Because it says, like, the evolutionary origins of what divides us. So he's taking an evolutionary look about political divides, which, if you are familiar with this kind of literature, you'll know that Jonathan Haidt took a similar approach in his oh man, what's the book called? It's from around this. It's around what, 2014. Oh man, I can't remember. I have an ebook copy. I haven't read it yet, but I know what the premise is. It's similar to this. It's about analyzing the political divides and what divides us and what explains for that divide. And this author rejects the idea that it's just a product of circumstance and upbringing. He thinks there's a deeper evolutionary basis to these, and I believe Jonathan Haidt has talked about like a temperamental basis. Like if you're more empathetic, if you're more I don't know, if you wear your heart on your sleeve, you're more temperamental to this side. If you're more, I don't know, individualistic and more bigger picture, I think is what he says, or whatever, but then you'd be more onto this other side. But anyways, I'll stop talking about what I don't know, and I'll start talking about the next book, which is a one volume of history that I found. This is called Ivan's War by Catherine Meridale. Ivan's War by Catherine Meridale. It's called, the subtitle is Life and Death in the Red Army, 1934 or 1939 to 1945. And this is a World War II book, and it's one of the few that I would actually be interested in. As much as World War II is super popular among casual history readers such as myself, World War II doesn't really interest me, and it's not just World War II, it's just war in general. Doesn't interest me, war tactics, what happens in battle. I'm just fine with the general basics, and then I can go from there. I'm not at all interested in the minutiae that goes into a lot of, what happens. I'm more interested in what leads up to war and what happens after war. So, books on the World War, I think I'll read a few general histories, but I won't go much deeper than that. This book, though, is an exception because I actually remember using this book in one of my history classes at university. It was a book it was a class on the 20th century, and I used this as one of my sources. I think I used either an online copy or I took it out from the library. And I remember this. It's on account of the soldier experience in World War II, particularly from the perspective of the Red Army. Because if you know anything about World War II, you know that the Red Army was absolutely brutal to its own soldiers. Not just how they treated them, like how they treated defectors, but actually how they put basically men who had no training, had very little equipment, and they just threw them into battle. And the only reason why it seemed to work out is because they had a massive amount of people, and they could overwhelm through numbers, versus, say, pointed tactics or technology or whatnot. And then this is just a study on that subject. So, and that's something that would be one of the few points that interest me about battle, the perspective of the soldiers and how it shaped them, like, because you always have survivors from these battles, and they go back and they contribute to society, but they bring about what happens, the experiences on the front lines, into their lives and into the culture that moves forward after the battle. So that's why that interests me. The next book is a book on ancient Rome. It's The Rise of Rome by Anthony Everett. It's the making of the world's greatest empire. I've never actually heard of this author before, but it's exactly what it looks like. It's a popular history on the rise of Rome, and I do have some books on Rome, but they're more textbooks. This is more of a general history, looking to introduce you to the ideas of how Rome came to power, and then if you're interested, you can do some deeper research and read some more difficult books on the subject, or more scholarly books. So, and that's what I'm going to treat this book as. It's not terribly long. It's about 400 pages. And there was a point when I was really interested in how Rome came to power. Not so much how it became super powerful in the sense of what we recognize as Rome today, or at least like how we see Rome from our hindsight today, but how Rome actually developed from extant community towns or cities in Italy and came together into this Roman Empire, or not Roman Empire, but Roman Republic that stretched quite all over the Mediterranean and Europe as well. So basically how it all began. And then we have another work of philosophy. This is actually just a textbook. It's the Philosophy, The Pursuit of Wisdom by Louis Podgman. I didn't really look at this book very detailed in the used bookstore, which I think I should have, because I just took from The Pursuit of Wisdom subtitle and then the really nice cover, actually. You can see it's just a really nice painting. I took that to mean that this will not be your usual standard philosophical textbook where it's just presenting arguments on different categories like does God exist, how can we know, or what is knowledge, or like how do we know, determinism, free will, theory of knowledge, the problem of mind, ethics. It's just a standard walkthrough of philosophical problems throughout history. That's not really what I was hoping it would be. I was hoping it would be more of like philosophy as a way of life. But that doesn't look like to be the case for this one. But it's short, it's not very long. So as an introduction to the subject, I'm sure it'll be interesting. So I'll still give it a read. And that's it for the non-fiction, at least the non-fiction that aren't classics. So I'll move on to the classics. We are at just over 20 minutes. See if I can get this under 35 minutes. We start off with another common theme over my used book hauls. If you watched my previous ones, I have another collection of plays. This is Ben Jonson. This is 3 comedies. And the 3 comedies here are Volpone, and The Alchemist, and then Bartholomew Fair. At one point, I wasn't interested in reading anything by Ben Jonson, so I usually turned down any of the used volumes I saw of his at a used bookstore. But this time I changed my mind, and I thought I'll pick it up because apparently he's an interesting contrast to the age of Shakespeare, really, too. So what kind of plays were performed in Shakespeare's day that weren't Shakespeare? So get a taste of that with Ben Jonson. And then I'll move on to, this is Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. This is a famous work of conservative writing where Edmund Burke was writing in reaction to the French Revolution, and he basically wrote what is now a tract on like traditional conservative ideas. It's a book that I've been wanting to get on my shelf for quite a while, but I wasn't willing to pay the, I don't know, $20-$30 to get a new copy, so getting it for cheap in a perfectly fine volume is just fine with me. And that's Edmund Burke. This next volume is also a work in translation. It has no cover though. This is a Loeb Classical Library edition of Caesar's, Civil Wars. So, if you are familiar with Loeb Classical Library, this is my very first volume of having Loeb. This is where they have the original on this side, so this is the Latin, and then they have the translation on the other side. And they're usually quite scholarly because they're made to be used by students or scholars who are looking for the original to translate for themselves or to like as a resource. So then the introduction is quite, at least from the sample that I read, is quite heavy, quite into the weeds, the details. And how much notes does this have? Doesn't look like it has a whole lot of notes actually. I don't actually own any works by Caesar or whoever was writing for Caesar. This is my first one. I just found it cheap and it's Loeb Classical edition, so I figured why not. But the edition that I really do want is that big fat landmark volume, the landmark Julius Caesar. That's the edition that I would want. And then next, now we go into straight fiction. So it's all novels from here on. And this is Isaac Asimov. This is his Foundation trilogy. So we got Foundation and Empire, and Second Foundation. And this is a beautiful modern, no, it's not modern, it's Everyman's Library edition. Where they have that very distinct look. They always have the author cover, and they got that distinct spine. But then when you pull back the dust jacket, then you have this beautiful red book. And this is a really good find. I did have to pay out a little bit extra for this, but still it was a lot cheaper than if I were to buy this brand new. And I only have the very first book in the Foundation trilogy as an ebook. I don't have any of the others. So having them all in this one volume is really quite nice. The only problem is that when I got home after this, I did not realize that this smells of smoke. So whoever owned this was very much a smoker. And I've thought like opening it like this, if I can really smell that. But if it becomes a major problem, I might have to get rid of this. Because that unless there's some way, or I can look online to get rid of that smell, but I can't imagine how. Because that smoke smell, even if it's not terribly strong, but I did sniff it, or did smell it when I opened it up like this, like that it just really got into that cover there, that fabric cover, which is really unappealing. Maybe if I just keep that on, or if I maybe add a plastic dust jacket or a plastic covering, maybe that will cover the smell. Because the pages really don't smell all that bad. It's just the ingrained into the fabric of the book. Next is really quite a find, and this might actually be one of the best finds. But the next few books are all going to be quite some of my favorite finds. And this is a collection of novels by John O'Hara. And this is Appointment in Samara, this is Butterfield 8, and then Hope of Heaven. So we got three. These two are novels, and this one's about a novella. It's about 100 pages long. But I've been wanting to read some John O'Hara for quite some time, and I don't have any of his works. And I wasn't about to buy them brand new. And he's not quite old enough where you can get his stuff for free online in the public domain either. So getting it in this quite attractive edition, you get a very happy author doing some very healthy practicing a very healthy habit in the back there. But it's a quite nice volume, and to have all three, to have three books in one is really nice, because they're not quite that. It's not very long at all. So of course it's able to do, and it's in good shape. So this was a really good find. And I was looking. Well, I'll mention that for the next book, because the next book is more John O'Hara, and it's a collection of his short stories, the O'Hara Generation. And it says 22 short stories by the master from his first 9 volumes, 1935 to 1966. So that, for those first 9 volumes, that's a total of 251 stories. This collects 22. And I would consider this more of a find than this novel one, because his novels are published in Penguin Classics. So I can get a copy of either of them, no problem, if I'm willing to fork over $20. But it's his short stories that always seem to be so elusive, because he's written a lot of them. He's known for publishing in The New Yorker, I believe. And I looked online, and it sounded like O'Hara was quite the cranky old man, and he did not allow to have his short stories published in anthologies that would be later to be used in schools. And so a lot of new generations don't get acquainted with O'Hara and his short stories, and so they fall out of print. I think the only O'Hara short story collection you can get in print is a short little volume by Penguin Classics that doesn't even have 22 short stories. And he wrote a lot of short stories, and even you look on the back there, you can see all that he's published. So finding this short this collection of short stories, which is a representative over most of his life. I believe he died in 1970, and he published maybe 2 more short story collections after that. 2 or 3 more. Maybe there's some that were published posthumously or after his death. But that's that volume. And then the next one was also a really good find, and I'm quite happy with this. This is Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. Dr. Zhivago. It's a striking cover, but also very minimalistic. And then when you look on the back, you get the joy of Russian literature embodied in this photo. And this is a Russian classic, of course. It won the author the Nobel Prize. It was, 1950s, late 1950s. And this is a novel that takes place in the Revolutionary War in, 1917, 1918, in that time frame there, when Russia turned over into a communist country. And this is his account of, or this is his novel taking place during that conflict, with the main character kind of in the midst of all this. And that's all I really know, but I really am interested in Russian classics. So I have a lot of Russian classics, 19th and 20th century. I read just a few of them, some of the main ones, like a few of the main Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. But I haven't read War and Peace just yet. But this adds to my 20th century Russian literature collection, and it's one that I've been wanting for quite a while. There's been many times where I was that close to buying a brand new edition. What interests me, though, is when I looked online, turns out there's only 3 translations of this work in existence, or 3 translations in English of this work. This one is translated by Max Howard and Mania Harari. Max Howard and Mania Harari. And that's the edition that was the translation that was published right when this was smuggled out of Russia, because of course it was not allowed to be published in the Soviet Union. So it had to be smuggled out, and then that's how it was circulated after that. This is the translation that people have been reading for decades. But then there was, in last 15 years or so, there's been 2 translations. There's Volkonsky. I forget the other translator. It's her husband, Richard something, and Volkonsky. They're a translating duo that's translated a lot of Russian classics, and they did a translation of this one around 15 years ago, which was the edition I was looking at. But then in 2019, the Folio Society did a translation that was exclusive to just the Folio Society, which was published by, I believe, the author's nephew, or at least like grandnephew or something, who's an accomplished translator on his own right. And so I wish I could get my hands on that one, but obviously if it's just exclusively in the Folio Society, and I've looked it up, the Folio Society is out of print. So that translation, and it's from, 6 years ago, that translation is just sitting there. No one will ever get to enjoy it and read it unless you're willing to fork up, $300-400 for that 2-volume set. So this translation has been the English introduction of this work to the West, so it'll be good enough for me. And then we get on to the last book, and I'm almost at 35 minutes. And this is John Mortimer, who's known for his Rumple of the Bailey series. I own the first volume omnibus, but I've not touched it yet. But this is looks to be more of like a serious work. Paradise Postponed, a novel. And this is, I don't actually know a whole lot about this book, other than that it was recommended by Steve Donahue at one point. And I've always kept that in mind. So when I find this beautiful hardcover, which we got a picture of the author on the back there. It's quite a striking cover. Like it almost looks like an explosion, or maybe it's supposed to be the sun. But that's, from what I understand, it's supposed to be a take on the dream of utopia, or like the post Cold War utopia, or post World War utopia that people have imagined, and that turned into its own nightmare. Because this book was published in 1985, so almost right at the end there of the Soviet Union. But that's all I really know about this book. That it seems to, and it's a British book too, so it plays off of conflicts from the British past. Like, for example, there's like this conflict that goes back to the Civil War of the 1600s in Britain, where you have the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, and apparently that still reflects in the society like 300 years later. So I don't really know a whole lot about that book, other than it was recommended by Steve Donahue, so if I find it a nice edition cheap, might as well give it a try. So that's my entire used book haul. Hopefully I won't have any more for quite a while, but I can't promise anything. So we'll see you, and see you next time.